When is an axe not an axe? When it's a hammer. Who would call this a hammer? Oh, you know, some medieval weirdos, you know how it is. All right, so poleaxes and halberds, what's the difference? Before I dive into the finer details of definition, just some practical aspects. First off, for visual reference, this is a poleaxe, this is a halberd. Now, again, this is a hammer, but still called an axe, we'll get to that. And lengthwise, it's quite a difference. So this is a bit short. I mean, if you had the butt spike as well, it would probably be more like this. But either way, typically, as a rule of thumb, a poleaxe tends to be no longer than the user, often shorter, and halberds are typically at least the length of the wielder, often longer. As with any rule, you can find exceptions. You can find particularly long poleaxes and particularly short halberds, so there might be a bit of overlap, but that's usually on average what you're dealing with. That also determines the usage to an extent, again, with some overlap. The poleaxe like this, you'll hold it with a fairly wide grip, the hand's relatively close to either end, and generally you have either a metal butt or spike at the end, also called queue in French. So this is used quite a bit for thrusting. And don't underestimate the effectiveness of even a blunt queue. This is a friendly competition with safety gear. And look at how much it rattles that guy's dome. You can use the other end, of course, as well for thrusting. You can strike with the hammer or axe, and with the spike as well for puncturing armor, of course. And also you can use it for hooking, hooking, pushing, anything like that. So the point of holding it in this sort of balanced grip is that you can switch pretty quickly between either end. So if the opponent strikes you, you can set it aside with the butt end and then either thrust like this or strike with the hammer. If we get into grappling, I'm able to use the bottom of the handle to hook the legs, the neck, the limbs, etc., things like that. And also I can still strike pretty effectively even at close range because I'm holding it like this. If I want more power, of course, I can slide the hands down and strike like this, which is going to hit way harder. But of course, if I miss, it's also going to take a little bit longer and be more exhausting to recover from that. And you can swap your hand position depending on which side you want to strike from, because if your right hand is on top, striking from the left is pretty awkward. Like, you could try to tuck this under, it's an option, but it's more effective to actually switch and strike full power like this from that side. And you can also use false edge strikes, like here with the spike, for example, coming down. And you can deflect like that as well. So if a strike comes from this side, you can deflect like so, and then you're already in position. A halberd you can also hold like this. You sometimes see it in the manuscripts. This simply depends on the distance that we're dealing with. If this is where we're at, then yes, I will want to hold it like this so I can strike well. But ideally, I want to make use of the reach with this long weapon. I have to basically be out of frame for this. And by the way, apologies for the dubious lighting and unappealing background is the best I can do inside here. And the outside world is covered in snow and ice right now. So it is what it is. Anyway, so one way to use it is basically like a spear. So you can thrust with the point, with this kind of sliding thrust, or, stepping into it like that. And of course you can also strike from here. Again, use the hook or spike in various ways, either for attacking or controlling, manipulating, hooking. And the maximum reach you can get by holding it this low is significant. So it's quite a bit farther away. If you imagine this with an axe blade instead of the hook, You can see the clear lineage here. This is the grandparent, basically, the Dane axe. You know, any kind of two-handed axe. You see a gradual development from this to, you know, different axe shapes with a spike at the end, and then eventually they get the idea of putting a spike on top as well, and eventually you get to the poleaxe and the halberd in its various different forms. There's definitely some gray area, some overlap. Sometimes looking at some of the historical depictions, it can be difficult to figure out, what is this? Is this an early halberd? Is this a poleaxe? Is this, you know, just a battle axe? I mean, arguably a poleaxe is a battle axe, just a particular subtype. The big difference in use between these two is the circumstance of armor development. At the time of the Dane axe, the best armor you could get was mail. And with this, of course, you have plate armor, depending on the exact time period, you know, anything from plate combined with mail to a full-on suit of plate, where mail is really only used for the gaps, you know, as voiders. And this has some pretty significant implications. For one, this of course is the response to such highly developed armor. You want to be able to do more damage to the armor, either with strikes, you know, be it with the hammer side of it, or with the point thrusting into the gaps of the armor. And it's also quite useful for grappling. And at the same time, it's also for use in armor, because now you can carry a two-handed weapon on the battlefield while being much safer than you would have been in earlier times. You know, if you think about the presence of arrows and javelins and various other projectiles on the battlefield, carrying this is quite a significant risk if you don't use a shield. Meanwhile, yeah, sure, you could sling a shield on your back and have some passive protection, but for the most part, while you're using this, you can be rather vulnerable. In full plate armor, you don't have to worry as much about it, so this becomes much more viable. All right, so terminology and definition. This would have made sense to do at the beginning, right? But I just didn't want to go in dry. This is a very dry topic, so I got to do it anyway, right? So what even is a poleaxe and a halberd, respectively? If we go by the dictionary definition, they're kind of all over the place. The Free Dictionary defines it as a medieval battle axe consisting of a long shaft ending in an axe or a combination of an axe, hammer, and pick. That's a very general definition because there are a number of battle axes that would fall under this. In fact, the Dane axe would technically fall under such a broad definition. You know, a long shaft ending in an axe. It also suggests it's simply another term for battle axe, which is, you know, not wrong as such, but basically, while every poleaxe is a battle axe, not every battle axe is a poleaxe. It's a more specific type. Lexico also says it's another term for battle axe and defines it as a short-handled axe with a spike at the back, formerly used in naval warfare for boarding, resisting boarders, and cutting ropes. They're talking about something very different. And this is kind of the problem with the term poleaxe. It sounds very general, right? You know, it could be any axe mounted to a pole. So almost any axe, you know, it depends on what you call a pole or a haft or a handle or what have you. This is very broad. Dictionary.com is much more specific. A medieval shafted weapon with blade combining axe, hammer, and apical spike used for fighting on foot. That seems very appropriate. By the way, sometimes it's spelled without the E. You know, whether you spell it AX or AXE is basically preference. AXE is more common, but there's really no difference. It's just different spellings for the same thing. Speaking of spelling, there is also the POLL spelling for poleaxe, and apparently there's been some debate about which is correct and where it comes from, what it means. You know, some people say the poleaxe is, you know, in the sense that it sounds, an axe mounted on a pole. Other people claim that the pole, P-O-L-L, refers to the hammerhead, you know, the hammer pole being attached to it. I don't really know, and frankly, I don't care. It's just spelling. The more common one is P-O-L-E, which is the one I'm going with. You can use P-O-L-L to narrow it down. It seems like if you type it into the search, you find more of what I would call knightly poleaxe, the specific type with axe blade, hammer, and apical spike, the way dictionary.com defines it. But I think if you really want to narrow it down, it's probably better to call it knightly poleaxe, to make clear that you're not talking about any kind of axe on a pole. As is so often the case, people in history didn't really care that much about specific terms the way we do now. If we look at the Italian fencing master Fiore, he calls it simply an axe, azza. Some German manuscripts use a term that translates to murder axe, but most sources simply call it an axe or a battle axe. In fact, even when it's clearly depicted as a hammer. The French manuscript Le Jeu de la Hache also calls it simply hache, axe, or hache d'armes, which is battle axe. All right, halberd. The Free Dictionary defines it as a weapon of the 1400s and 1500s having an axe-like blade and a steel spike mounted on the end of a long shaft. Dictionary.com, shafted weapon with an axe-like cutting blade, beak, and apical spike used especially in the 15th and 16th centuries. And Lexico simply defines it as a combined spear and battle axe, which is interesting. Definitely not wrong. By the way, you might have heard of the term Lucerne hammer, which is a 19th century term named after a town in Switzerland, which consists of a pronged hammer on the one side and a beak or hook on the other side, which is called bec de corbin, which is crow's or raven's beak, sometimes also called bec de faucon, which just means falcon's beak. This is also a pole axe, or again, in the historical sources, they sometimes simply call it axe. Personally, I prefer to call this simply a pole hammer to avoid confusion. It can be a little tricky to figure out what's the earliest halberd, because as said, there is a gradual transition from various battle axes to halberds, and it's kind of up to personal opinion where you draw the line exactly. You can't really, there's going to be some gray area. But usually the Battle of Morgarten in 1315 is typically named as the earliest evidence of the use of halberds on the battlefield. This illustration here, by the way, is from over 150 years later. So this form here, what's called early halberd, the top right there doesn't even have a back spike. The bottom one is hafted differently, more like a Lochaber axe or a Voulge. Now, is a Voulge a halberd, perhaps a proto-halberd? Some have no back spike, sometimes the spike is a separate piece. Whether or not you want to call it that, I think this illustrates the difference well. On the left you've got a Voulge, on the right a halberd. So the halberd was used from the 14th century, depending on exactly how you want to define it, perhaps as early as the early 14th century, and then particularly in the 15th and 16th century. The practical use of halberds was generally discontinued by the early 18th century, although it was still carried by sergeants and officers as rank insignia, basically, and you still see them made as ceremonial pieces as late as the 19th century. So the halberd has quite a long lifespan, while the poleaxe is pretty much limited to the 14th and 15th centuries. One way to distinguish poleaxes from halberds is by looking at the construction. Halberd heads are generally made of one piece, while poleaxes consist of multiple pieces. One is the langets, that's actually one piece that fits over the head and attaches to the haft, and the top spike is forge welded or brazed onto it. And then the side spikes that you sometimes see are actually the ends of a pin through everything to secure the head, the langets, to the haft. Sometimes the ends of that pin are just domes, sometimes they're shaped into spikes. Another distinctive element of poleaxes is that they often have a disc guard attached to them, which is not a feature you find on halberds. All right, after all this, I sincerely hope your question won't be, which is better? Because if that's your question, then I have failed. Or your attention span seems to be that of a severely concussed knight after being knocked in the helmet by one of these. If you're really itching for some sort of scoring, this is what I came up with. Basically, they're very close, with the exception that the halberd is longer and has thereby more reach and is harder to carry. The poleaxe is better against armor, and I'd argue it's slightly slower because it tends to be heavier on average than a halberd, although I'm sure that's debatable. And a halberd should generally be more affordable, seeing how it was often a soldier's weapon, not always, while the knightly poleaxe is an upper class weapon. Right, hope that helped clear things up a little bit. Let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching and have a good one, folks.